Good afternoon all. Let's have a look at a brilliant game played recently by Natalia Pogonina. This is against Alisa Galliamova, and it was played in the Russian women's Superfinal of 2011. Now Galliamova is actually a 2 times world women's vice champion, and I believe she also won the Superfinals in the previous year in 2010. So Natalia playing white, kicked off with e4, and we have a fighting Sicilian defence. Natalia is not scared to go into the main line of Sicilian, the open Sicilian. After e6 she plays d4. Okay, we have the classic exchange of the flanked pawn on c5 for the centre pawn. C takes d4. And we have a fight on our hands. After knight takes d4, a6. A useful move in many variations of the Sicilian, not just preventing white using b5, but also b5 and bishop b7 would exert pressure on e4, as well as provide a kind of security for this usually very useful outpost square on the semi-open c file, this c4 square. So a6 is a great move. After knight c3 we have d6, Scheveningen structure with the flexibility for either of these pawns to liberate black's position in the future, and so it needs to be kept under lock and key, the centre. But as well as that, d5 and e5, a liberating break of course can be considered b5, and that's clamped down on now by Natalia's next move a4. So we have restraint on the queen side a little bit. Now the move b6, which maybe rules out later white trying to seal the b6 square with a5. I might try and get manoeuvres like this into b6, but now it's kind of all prevented. So black is getting on with queenside development, leaving the king in the centre for the moment. And if a5 now, maybe b5, don't have to take on a5, just b5, as well as another alternative, leaving the a pawn kind of vulnerable. So bishop e2, and now bishop b7. So that's the other point, of course, about b6. It facilitates this pressure on e4 anyway. After f4 we have here a move which really means bishop f3 to secure e4 without the f pawn being blocked, and the f pawn can be quite dangerous, as this game will demonstrate. So knight d7 and now bishop f3. Okay, so an interesting scene is set, and now queen c7. Which means, of course, that the bishop is protected by the queen, and knight f6 is not going to be rudely answered in some variations with e5, exposing an attack on the bishop. So black's position is fairly secure after queen c7, although some questions are brought to black now very soon. After castles, bishop e7, king h1, prophylaxis against potential d5s later, checks or pins on the diagonal. Put the king tidily away on h1. Okay, it also means if bishop e3 later, maybe bishop g1 is possible as well, if knight f6 to g4. So there's a few ideas behind king h1, although some would argue is it losing a move, but it's useful. Black plays a useful move now. Instead of knight f6 getting on with development and trying to castle on the king side, black actually plays rook d8. Okay, so rook d8, there might be some sort of idea to liberate here with knight c5 and d5, trying to crack open the centre and only then commit. And maybe if white's prompted after d5 to play e5, then this knight might even consider knight h6 to f5 in the future. So white's got to be positionally careful. But is black being too clever with this rook d8? The king, after all, is still in the centre here. White now plays a very aggressive looking move, but in other ways it can be considered as weakening dark squares, this f5 move. Now of course knight e5 is not possible here because the knight and the pawn are targeting that e6, so e6 really has to move here. In which case e5 is not going to be such an exploitable dark square weakness. But of course f5 also means that a potential for knight f6, and this pawn will be backward on e4, and maybe later black tries to exchange off dark square bishops, and these dark squares might actually be vulnerable later. But after e5 white puts basically a spanner in the works here. It doesn't give black a comfortable game. White has weakened the dark squares a little bit with this f5, and this pawn, could be quite vulnerable in the future, especially with imminent like knight c5s and d5s, especially with a rook on d8. The d5 breakout is not to be considered lightly. But there's an interesting move. The spanner is put in the works here with Natalia's next move. I'll give you 10 seconds to see if you can guess it. I'll take away the arrows. So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, not a knight retreat, but the knight going forward into the centre, thrusting in the centre of black's position. Okay, so with the queen attacked and g7 attacked, it's difficult for black to avoid not taking it. If the queen moves knight takes g7, it looks fairly disastrous, or knight takes d8 is another juicy option, just winning the exchange. Okay, so the knight's taken. And now not an immediate recapture of the pawn, but actually a check. And here, g6 I think looks fairly unpalatable because of fg, and then if knight f6, the discovered check would actually be queening that pawn. So g6 doesn't look too tempting at all. So actually king f8, and after f takes e6, okay, we have a situation where it's a pawn for a knight. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the key question here, though, these knights and this rook, there's a bit of congestion. This pawn sort of dislocates black position. But does white have to worry about e4 at the moment? Well, there's a nasty pin on f6 anyway. But these knights in particular, white's play looks as though it's playing on that congestion, and we're going to have here an orchestration of attack on the queen side as well, pretty soon, believe it or not, as well as the king side, using the fact that black's communication has been cut off by this pawn on e6, and the king is not ideally placed on f8. It's getting in the way of the rooks being connected. So this is a difficult position for black, this dislocation created by this pawn on e6. And this next move kind of celebrates the pawn on e6, secures it. This next move is knight d5. Now, can black have avoided taking on d5 here with a move like queen? If queen c5, that's a bit disastrous actually, because bishop e3, and the knight's protecting that queen to support the further dismantling of the queen side, starting with b6. So if queen c5 is out of the question, what about something like queen c4 or queen c8? Let's do an engine check here actually. Did the knight have to be taken? Because really it's reinforcing e6. Actually the engine kind of almost technically favours black with queen c8 here. So it's kind of an intuitive knight sacrifice actually. But here a move rook a3 is apparently giving white at least equality. This rook switch is very powerful, afforded by that a4. So even if that pawn's lost, this could still be dangerous, this kind of variation for black. Because look at these tangled forces over here in particular. Okay, but that's a bit murky. What black played actually was reinforcing the pawn on e6. And actually from a technical point of view, what is the evaluation here of reinforcing that pawn? After e takes d5, actually my engine Houdini it's giving white a tiny advantage, or about equality. It's still murky waters here. Okay, so we have a murky position. It's not totally clear. Black's not totally without resources. Very sharp. I don't know how you would evaluate this. It looks visually impressive, these pawns. This pawn here supports things like bishop f7. And this g pawn might actually be dangerous if this knight's pinned. Maybe it's even worth considering g4 at some point to try and exploit this pin. Okay, but black is trying to untangle, gives an escape square for her king as well, away from the f-file, with this g6, giving g7 as a square. Okay, so the bishop retreats. Bishop doesn't just retreat though, it's attacking actually a6. And that's not being pedantic, attacking a6, because you'd think the attention is now on the king side. But if white can snag 1 or 2 pawns on the queen side, that's going to add to black's future concerns. Here, actually, black didn't meekly defend a6 with a move like Queen b7 or Rook a8. Black actually played h5. So h5, trying to give maybe some scope for the rook. You know, maybe this is going to be dangerous in the future. Maybe knight g4 is going to be useful if bishop a6. Maybe knight h6 to f5 might be on the cards. There's a few possibilities afforded by h5. But for the moment, white actually casually played rook a3, so getting this other rook into the game, potentially on either the f file to exert pressure on f6, or g3 to exert pressure on g6, which has been weakened by that h5 move. That's the weakness of the last move, g6 here. So that's kind of been targeted, this rook entry via a3, very interesting. So black's in a kind of bind. But black deprives the use of g3 now with this next move, h4. So that purpose, and also potentially to create a goal hanging pawn on h3, if allowed. But here white snags the pawn on the queen side, bishop takes a6. And so black is struggling to develop pieces naturally. I mean, especially this rook. It's a bit of a miserable rook at the moment. And this c file, after that winning that pawn, you know, c4 might be afforded to shut down the c file. Okay, but if king g7 was played, and now a very restrictive move, because you know we mentioned knight h6 to f5, but a lot of these possibilities are cut out now rather horribly with this next move, g4. Even though it's giving black's rook on h8 some scope if the en passant is used, which it is, it means actually this rook can come in and exert more pressure than before, because the rooks can be doubled on g6. So this next move couldn't have been taken too lightly by black to play, actually, because the g file now is quite dangerous for g6. But if it's not played, then black really suffers congestion. You know, knight h6, there's g5 forking both knights, and g5 in its own right as a threat for rook f7 is also looking fairly lethal. So this looks like black's position is going downhill rather badly. It's a choice of lesser evils, this move, it seems, hg. Okay, so rook takes g3. So how is black going to defend now g6? Well, black plays rook h4. Okay, rook h4. And now the move bishop e3 is played, because maybe, you know, Natalia wants to keep control of d4, not to allow rook d4. That might be one of the major points about rook h4. Now we see rook f8. And now the rooks can double on g6. And black has no easy way of defending g6 here. Rook h6, the bishop takes. How does black defend g6? In fact, g6 is offered, so knight h7. Natalia takes on g6, but now g8's the next target, as well as other things. After king h8, it's difficult for black. This next move creates a nasty pin now on the 7th rank, that bishop being tied now to the queen. But also, if white can get kind of Anakine's gun, if white can treble on the g file, then g8 is going to be a major thing to destroy next on the g file. So this next move, knight gf6, these knights are kind of miserable. One thing about, you know, sacrificing a piece intuitively for a bind or dislocation is you've got to watch out to not give the opponent's knight squares. I think that's one rule, that the knights can often be quite cramped. If you can keep them cramped, not getting any major central squares, then that really helps the attack. And the cramping of black is now reinforced actually with this next move, c4. Well, that looks a bit strange to put keep the bishop outside of the pawn chain over here. The bishop's doing a good job. You know, it can come back to b5 later, and then has scope along this diagonal. But it's reinforcing c4 from there on a6, and it's shutting out basically this knight out of the game, helping shut that out. But black's got e4 here, but it's really dangerous now on the g file. Rook g8. Okay, one pair of rooks is taken off, and now queen f3, which signifies potential invasion point f7 or f5 potentially. Okay, and it's difficult for black really to do much. So bishop f8 is almost ruled out, but the knight's just about protecting f8. So if the queen did want to try and get back, but at the moment there's no real squares. These two squares are under white's control really. This pawn and this rook firing on f7 and g7. But black plays knight gf6. And now another reinforcing move, b3, which might mean the bishop is now free actually to do something in the future. It doesn't have to support c4. c4 is nicely secured now. Queen d8. So the queen, it hasn't got too many squares. It's, with this bishop, covering c5. Where is that queen actually going? So white's queen is much more attacking at the moment. But the queen can come to f8 potentially usefully. But here bishop b5. But note the queen is also tied down to the b6 pawn. So any queen f8, you can just snap off that pawn. White can snap off that pawn. So as an option. But even so, black plays queen f8 now. So the question then now is, was bishop takes b6 possible? I think there must be a nasty tactic against bishop takes b6, because Natalia's next move was actually rook g2. Let's see, bishop takes b6. Let's add bits and just check bishop takes b6. Rook g2 is given as actually one of the very strongest moves in the position. Here, this apparently is okay as well, but not as good as rook g2 immediately. I think black's getting a little bit of counterplay in this position. This might be completely unnecessary to give black this level of counterplay with bishop takes b6. So Natalia is doing a very wise thing actually. It seems to be one of the very strongest moves, because really queen f8 in this position. The queen really does want to go to h6 to intensify pressure on h2. Why allow any of this? Why take the pawn? So Natalia's next move, rook g2, is actually given by Houdini as one of the strongest moves in the position. So keeping the queen out of useful squares as well as the knights is like one of the main strategies of following through on this kind of intuitive knight sacrifice which was played earlier on. So if black's not given any useful options, black should fall apart eventually. Black plays bishop d8, and now we've got an asset over the queen side anyway, which is now realised. There's a potential for an outside pass pawn. After b4, if the bishop doesn't remain on d8, then a5 creates an outside running passed pawn here. So black is starting to get a bit more loaded up again with more responsibilities against a5, even though b6, okay, it's supported, and this bishop's also preventing a5 at the moment for the creation of that outside pass pawn. But this next move is looking aggressive and offering the exchange of queens. Knight g4. Now Natalia did exchange queens here. So okay, so what's the situation materially again? Let's just remind ourselves. 3, 4, 5, 6 against 3. It's actually 3 pawns for the knights, but black's pieces are really tied down at the moment. One interesting thing here is it would look as though white wants to keep pressure on b6. But Natalia's next move actually signifies something else is going on. In fact, that to support the creation of the outside pass pawn, this next move is even better. Forget attacking b6, just directly support a5. This next move, bishop d2. So a5 is now a serious threat to create the outside pass pawn. Black plays knight f6, and the outside pass pawn is created now, a5. So okay, 3 pawns for the piece. It looks to be starting to be well worth it now with this newfound pass pawn. So it takes a knight e4, and the pawn is pushed a6. And here, if knight takes d2, that can be safely ignored, I think, because of a7. Knight f3 will be harmless because the rook's guarding h2, and the queen, there's nothing to stop the pawn queening. So actually, the rook has to try and get behind this outside pass pawn here. She does so with rook h3 to try and play rook a3. So very dramatic. But now a beautiful, beautiful idea from Natalia. I wonder if I give you 10 seconds to try and exploit your outside passed a pawn here. What move would you play here? 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, may your pass pawn's queen with bishop a5. Bishop a5, because not only, rook a3 can now be answered by bishop takes d8. If bishop takes a5, then a7, and the rook is stopped from munching the pawn, because then a8 and the bishop's in the way. I think the check here is mostly harmless because of rook g1, if knight f2 king g2. So that would be queening that pawn. So bishop a5, but let's engine check just to make sure that this was actually a totally sound tactic. It's a crushing tactic. Houdini validates this tactic. In this position, bishop a5, the absolute strongest move, with e7 as a second place move as well, doing the job as well. e7, and then actually bishop b4, curiously. So that's rather more technical. This is much more elegant, this bishop a5 move. Beautiful exploitation of the outside passed pawn. So what seemed to be like a token a pawn proved to be much more decisive, approaching the endgame here. So black played down knight takes e6. I'm not sure. This move looks a little bit desperate. After d takes e6, is the picture changed with this outside passed pawn? It doesn't seem so much so. After rook a3, so the bishop doesn't take on a5, just bishop takes d8, and here black resigned. The check is harmless here because of rook g1 and knight f2 king g2. So black resigned here, lots of material down, and also now faced with e7, of course. So it's going to be easy to convert this. So let's have a look at this game again. So we have here a very interesting knight sacrifice. Now if you're going to play such a knight sacrifice at home, remember, don't give any squares to the opponent's knights or queen. No squares at all. You don't want the opponent to have big knights on e5, etc., or any squares of great significance. You don't want the opponent's queen to join rooks for any batteries. With those principles in mind, such a knight sacrifice, if you can grab a pawn as well on the queen side, then later you can create a dangerous outside passed pawn, which will further overload the opponent's position. So I think in terms of strategy, this was an attack played on both sides of the board with a very dynamic, intuitive knight sacrifice from a seemingly a wolf in sheep's clothing opening, because it looks as though white's primary plans involved clamping down on b5 and d5, but with this knight sacrifice it changed the whole nature of the position, in fact, where it was really about this clamping down in a broader sense, not of particular squares but of pieces. So instead of square, pawn liberations being clamped down, it was now specific pieces being targeted for massive congestion in the black position. After king h1, rook d8, we have here the move f5. Now if this is not followed up correctly, if it's followed up meekly after e5 with knight b3, black would have a great game. It would justify black's setup, things like knight c5 and d5 breaking out in the centre. But no, the dislocating knight sac with knight e6 was played. So we're trying to cut down the scope of all of black's pieces, not give them any decent squares. Make sure they're kept away from the centre and away from teamwork in the form of batteries. So bishop h5 check, king f8, taking on e6, discovering a check, and now knight d5, securing that advanced pawn on e6. Now maybe objectively best here was queen c8, but this is another reasonable looking move, just to play bishop takes d5, getting rid of that horrible knight on d5. After e takes d, g6, and now the bishop on e2, maybe objectively best here was protecting the pawn, but Alisa decided h5 was the way to go. Perhaps she wanted more scope for her pieces, with potentials, for h4, h3, other potentials for getting the knight to h6 to f5. But Natalia's next move shows greater superiority of the rooks, which is a common theme, for how many of these high-level games are won. If white can demonstrate higher quality, more active rooks, that's the first sign that there's going to be major problems for black. After h4, the pawn is snagged, and that's a future asset for the creation of the outside passed a pawn, snapping up that pawn. So respect material gain sometimes. So king g7, g4. Now this move g4 Looks a bit counterintuitive to give black's rook on h8 even more scope, which could have spelt disaster if black can organise a battery later with the rook and queen, which was almost the case later, but Natalia was very careful not to allow the intensification of pressure on h2. So with that in mind, hg, rook takes g3. White's trying to make use of the g file whilst not emphasising black's trump card of the h file pressure. Okay, so rook h4. And now this next move, bishop e3, make sure there's no rook d4s, among other things. Another question actually here is actually rook takes a4. Would that have been actually plausible? Let's just check just briefly this position. Just notice rook a4. Would that be refuted somehow? Queen d3 actually not only protects the bishop but also more is about g6. If e4 here, queen e2, then the rook is really cut out of the defensive duties on the king's side. So queen g2, we have quite a lethal battery. So that's probably why rook a4 is not to be considered. Okay, so in this position, rook f8, fg1, dangerous battery for white. Taking that g6, now g8's the target. Horrible pin on the 7th rank. Now c4, further consolidating on the queen side before preparing to create the outside passed a pawn. So white takes on g8 now, queen f3. After b3 again, further strengthening on the queen side before the virtual attack with the creation of the passed a pawn. So queen d8, and it looks as though, you know, if black can get in queen f8 to h6 in the ideal world, even offering b6, then black might have drumming up, as the expression goes, some counterplay. But at the moment, the drums are not allowed to beat any faster or louder because white shuts them down. Drummer go away. Rook g2. No queen h6. Just want to try and arrange the passed a pawn, keeping these knights out of the game virtually. So here, after bishop d8, not so depressing. Doesn't matter that b6 protected. b4 anyway. After knight g4, the queen is now taken, and we have then now more emphasis on that creation of the outside passed a pawn. So knight f6, a5, we've got the outside passed a pawn, one of the strongest types of passed pawns you can have. After knight e4, a6, and now the tactics come to the rescue of the strategic, the strategic implementation. It's accelerated for the use of a very, very nice tactic here. So there's bishop a5. Okay, and black's really in a lost position now. Desperate move, knight e6. And now bishop takes d8 is a trivial win here. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Congratulations, Natalia, and comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks so much.